The Hungarian army marches through fog, believing the war is over, unaware the mountains are already watching. Unseen figures watch from the heights, silent scouts tracking every step of the incoming royal army. The Hungarian soldiers find empty villages, no resistance, no enemies, only silence shaped with intent. The deeper they march, the heavier the silence becomes, and the army grows blind to the trap forming. Short on supplies and far from home, the Hungarian king orders a retreat, believing danger has passed. Basarab watches quietly. The Hungarian army enters the narrow mountain corridor, the single route Basarab needed them to take. Once the entire army is trapped inside, Basarab's watchers signal, 3 stones rolling downhill. The cliffs erupt, stones, logs, and earth collapse onto the packed Hungarian formation below. Orders collapse. As the vanguard reverses, the rear pushes forward. Panic crushes the army from within. Panic spread through the Hungarian column like a spark in dry grass. The front tried to fall back, the rear pushed forward, and the center, already the tightest part of the formation, was squeezed until men could barely lift their arms. Knights accustomed to wide battlefields now found themselves trapped shoulder to shoulder, armor clashing against armor as horses reared in blind terror. Falling stones continued to strike from above, smashing helmets and splintering shields. What moments ago had been an organized retreat was now a suffocating mass where survival depended on inches, not tactics. As chaos tightened below, the slopes above revealed the true scale of Basarab's preparation. Wallachia detachments positioned along natural ridges rose from behind boulders and tree roots, their silhouettes calm and controlled against the pale sky. They had been waiting for this exact moment, when the Hungarian line was trapped so tightly it could no longer maneuver. These fighters did not shout, did not rush, did not taunt. They simply took aim, drawing their bows with the patience of hunters who knew the land would finish what they started. The first true sign that escape had vanished came from the wagons. With terrified horses kicking and bolting under falling debris, wagons toppled or crashed sideways, instantly blocking the narrow roadway. Soldiers tried to push them aside, but the passage was too tight. Even a single overturned cart became an immovable wall. Every wagon that broke added another link to the chain sealing the Hungarian army inside the pass. Within minutes, the road transformed into a maze of broken wood, twisted wheels, and trapped men, a perfect barrier, designed not by chance but by Basarab's ruthless understanding of terrain. Without warning, the mountains answered with force. The first wave of stones crashed down in a violent cascade, smashing through wagons, armor, and bone alike. Soldiers barely had time to lift their shields before another wave followed, and another, each rolling with the unstoppable momentum only gravity could provide. The narrow pass magnified every sound. A single impact echoed like thunder trapped in stone. Men tried to shield their comrades, but the angles were impossible. Every boulder landed where shields could not rise, turning the pass into a corridor of crushing ruin. Before the soldiers could recover from the stone barrage, far deadlier force emerged. Logs, carefully positioned days earlier, now released with perfect timing. They tumbled violently down the slopes, bouncing between rock walls and slamming into tightly packed men. Shields shattered like pottery. Lines broke instantly. Heavy cavalry, the pride of the Hungarian host, found itself crushed under wooden beams instead of enemy blades. The logs tore through the formation, leaving behind trails of wreckage and screams that curled upward into the cold November air. In the wake of the destruction, confusion spread faster than fear. Officers shouted contradictory commands: advance, retreat, hold the line, but none of them matched the reality of a space so tight even a sword could barely be drawn. Men shoved blindly in every direction, each trying to survive the next falling stone. Horses bucked uncontrollably, kicking soldiers who had nowhere to flee. What discipline had held the army together collapsed completely, replaced by instinct and desperation. The Hungarian host no longer resembled an army, only a trapped mass waiting for whatever came next. Once the Hungarian formation had lost all shape, the Wallachians unleashed their archers. From 3 different elevations, volleys descended with terrifying precision. They aimed not at shields, but at gaps, horse reins, wagon crews, officers recognizable by their armor. Arrows fell faster than men could react, turning every attempt to regroup into another moment of bloodshed. From the ground, it felt as if the sky itself had turned against them. The pass became a hollow drum for the echoes of impact, each strike another reminder that the heights were not just an advantage, they were absolute control. Desperation pushed groups of Hungarian soldiers to attempt the impossible, scaling the cliffs under fire. Knights dismounted, gripping exposed roots and jagged rocks, while infantry tried to form human ladders in places where the stone walls offered no holds. Wallachia fighters simply shifted positions, releasing arrows and stones at the climbers until they slid back into the chaos below. Every attempt cost lives, and none gained even a foothold. The mountains were not merely steep, they were allies of the defenders, shaping the battlefield in ways no army could match. From above, the pass looked like a tightening funnel. From within, it felt like suffocation. Waves of men pressed toward dead ends, formed by shattered wagons, fallen logs, and bodies they could not move. Every step was a struggle against armor, debris, and each other.
Now?
The sound of battle was replaced by the sound of survival, men gasping, horses screaming, metal scraping against stone. Trapped between cliffs and the enemy, the Hungarian army realized the cruel geometry of the trap. Every attempt to move only tightened the noose. High above the devastation, Basarab watched with calm control. He did not need to shout commands. The land, the slopes, and gravity were doing everything he had planned. His men rotated positions, conserving strength while the Hungarians burned through theirs. In Basarab's silence lay the strategy that defined the battle, not aggression, but patience. Below him, the greatest army in Eastern Europe struggled to take a single cohesive step. Above him, the ruler of Wallachia understood the simple truth that had eluded his enemies. Power belonged to the man who chose the ground. Night brought no relief. The temperature dropped sharply, coating armor with a thin layer of frost that made every movement more painful. Fires could not be lit. Any spark would reveal a cluster of survivors to the Wallachians above. Horses, injured and terrified, groaned through the darkness while soldiers whispered prayers, afraid that any louder breath would draw an arrow from the ridges. The bodies of fallen comrades lay where they had collapsed, impossible to move in the crush. As the cold seeped into their bones, the Hungarians finally understood the worst truth of the trap. They were not simply losing a battle. They were being worn down hour by hour. At dawn, pale light revealed a scene far worse than the Hungarians had imagined. The slopes remained occupied. Shadows shifted between the rocks as Wallachian archers rotated into fresh positions. The trapped column was now fractured into pockets, small clusters of men separated by fallen logs, broken wagons, and heaps of debris. The officers tried to restore order, but exhaustion hung over the troops like a heavy cloak. Some soldiers attempted to gather water from a narrow runoff trickling down the cliff, only to be met with arrows that sent them collapsing back into the mass. Day 2 had begun, and the mountains were already hungry again. While the Hungarians grew weaker, the Wallachians only grew more efficient. Their archers operated in rotating groups, allowing one line to rest while another stepped forward to fire. They conserved arrows, aiming only at targets that threatened order. Anyone trying to rally troops, free a horse, or climb the slope. Unlike traditional battles fought in bursts, this was a steady, unbroken pressure that drained courage as much as strength. Every few minutes, another arrow descended. Not enough to cause mass panic, but enough to ensure the Hungarians never regained their footing. As the hours passed, the number of fallen began shaping the battlefield itself. Bodies of men and horses blocked narrow segments of the pass, forcing survivors to climb over armor and limbs just to shift positions. Some knights removed their helmets simply to breathe more easily, while infantrymen discarded shields too heavy to hold. The once proud royal host now looked more like refugees trapped in a collapsing mine than an army. Each attempt to move forward or backward ended in frustration as the dead formed grim barricades that even the living could not clear. Determined not to die trapped on the road, small groups attempted to scale the cliffs again. Knights stripped off parts of their armor to lighten themselves, while infantry formed crude ladders with shields and spear shafts. The mountains rejected them. Loose stones gave way, roots snapped, and Wallachia fighters simply shifted positions higher up the slopes, releasing stones and arrows that sent the climbers tumbling back into the pass. Every attempt drained morale further, convincing soldiers that the land itself had chosen a side, and it wasn't theirs. By midday, the collapse of discipline turned inward. Soldiers argued over water, shoved others aside for space, and some even abandoned wounded comrades to save themselves. Officers attempted to restore control, but their voices were lost beneath the grinding chaos of armor, hooves, and falling debris. The king's presence no longer inspired courage. Many soldiers didn't even know where he was. The proud Hungarian host, which once marched in perfect ranks, now resembled a frightened mass surviving minute by minute. And the Wallachians, still calm on the heights, watched as the enemy slowly destroyed itself. Somewhere within the shrinking clusters of survivors moved King Charles I, no longer distinguishable by royal insignia, which his guards had stripped away to avoid drawing fire. He staggered among common soldiers, his armor dented and muddied like theirs. Royal command had dissolved entirely, was protected only by the few men still loyal enough to shield him with their bodies. For the first time in his reign, Charles experienced war, not from horseback or behind lines, but from inside the crushing panic of infantry, feeling the same dread that gripped every man around him. The second night was worse than the first. Exhaustion turned to despair as wounded men moaned through the darkness and horses collapsed where they stood. The screams of the previous day were replaced by silence broken only by shifting armor and the distant crack of stones rolling on the slopes. Soldiers clung to each other for warmth, while others stared blankly into the shadows, convinced they would never leave the pass alive. Even the Wallachians, watching from above, could sense the psychological collapse unfolding below. They didn't need to attack constantly. The mountains were doing the work now. As daylight returned, the pass revealed a grim transformation. What had been the Hungarian military highway was now a corridor of the dying men too weak to stand, horses unable to rise, and wounded soldiers begging for water that could not be reached. The smell of blood, mud, and fear filled the air. Those still able to fight had lost the will. They now searched not for victory, but for any path out of the nightmare. But every direction was blocked by cliffs, debris, and the watchful eyes of Wallachian archers who never needed to descend. The road itself had become a grave. By late afternoon, small Hungarian groups attempted desperate escapes through side ravines and hidden forest paths. Some climbed narrow ledges, others crawled along goat trails. A few even stripped off armor to move faster. But Wallachian scouts tracked every movement from the heights, intercepting most attempts with arrows or rolling stones. Only a handful slipped into the forests, disappearing like ghosts into the cold November wind. For the majority still trapped in the pass, escape remained a faint hope, when the mountains refused to give easily. The third night was a turning point, not of strategy, but of spirit. The Hungarians no longer whispered plans or reassurances. They barely whispered at all. Cold settled deeper than armor could defend, stiffening limbs and slowing breath. Wounded men begged their comrades to leave them, knowing that carrying anyone now meant death for both. Even the strongest veterans stared upward at the cliffs with hollow eyes, realizing the mountain that once guided their march home had become their executioner. In the pitch darkness, hope didn't fade, it froze. Day 4 arrived with a pale, unforgiving light. The Wallachians resumed their assault, not with overwhelming force, but with deliberate pressure. A few arrows here, a rolling stone there, enough to keep the trapped men awake, alert, and terrified. The Hungarian army had ceased to exist as a coordinated force. No clear units remained, only clusters of survivors clinging to the little space they had left. Every attempt to regroup crumbled immediately. Every shouted order vanished into the echo of suffering. The battle was no longer fought with weapons, but with exhaustion. By midday, the narrow pass resembled something between a battlefield and a tomb. Fallen men lay where they had collapsed, forming uneven mounds that survivors had to climb over just to shift positions. Horses, once the pride of the cavalry, lay motionless, their bodies sealing entire stretches of road. The stench of blood and crushed earth thickened the air, yet Basarab's forces did not descend, maintained their distance, allowing terrain, hunger, thirst, and fear to finish the destruction. The pass itself was doing the fighting now, and it was winning. At the center of the collapse, King Charles I stood among what little remained of his royal guard. Their armor, once polished and unmistakably noble, was now dented, stained, and indistinguishable from that of common soldiers. They formed a shrinking circle around their king, deflecting arrows, dragging away fallen comrades, and shielding him from the worst of the chaos. But even their devotion had limits. Every hour claimed more lives, and the circle grew smaller. For the first time, the king who came to enforce obedience now relied on anonymity to survive. In a final attempt to save what remained, a group of Hungarian knights tried to organize a breakout charge. They removed damaged armor plates, mounted any horse still capable of standing, and prepared to rush the narrowest point of the pass. But before they advanced 10 steps, arrows cut into their formation. Horses buckled, riders fell. The Wallachians shifted like shadows along the cliffs, cutting off every attempt to gather speed. The breakout collapsed before it had even begun, a tragic reminder that valor means nothing when the ground itself forbids escape. While chaos consumed the pass, Basarab remained calm, issuing quiet orders from the heights. His strategy was never to overwhelm the Hungarians with sheer force. It was to deny them space, air, and options. He avoided unnecessary risks, avoided rushing victory, and refused to allow emotion to dictate the end. From his vantage point, he monitored every movement below, adjusting pressure only to maintain collapse, not accelerate it. Victory to him was not measured in bodies, it was measured in control. And control he had completely. By late afternoon, the Hungarian survivors clustered in small groups. Defending themselves behind fragments of wagons and fallen logs, they fought not to win, but to delay the inevitable. Some clung to swords with trembling hands. Others used broken shields as makeshift barriers, but the Wallachians did not rush them. They simply maintained fire from the heights, cutting down any soldier who climbed above the others. The survivors understood now. No reinforcements would come, no rescue would appear, and no miracle would break the trap. This was the end of the Hungarian army inside the pass. As evening shadows lengthened, a small group of guards discovered a narrow, almost invisible path carved into the rocks. They urged the king to move, now or never. Stripping anything that marked him as royalty, Charles I followed his guards up the hidden route. Every step was agony, every breath a prayer. Below him, the pass still roared with chaos. Above him, the path twisted into silence. When they finally reached the forest edge, the king looked back only once. His army, once the pride of Hungary, had been reduced to shadows swallowed by stone. When the final echoes of battle faded across the mountains, the pass fell into a silence so absolute it felt unnatural. Like the land itself was catching its breath after witnessing 4 days of unbroken suffering. The Wallachian scouts descended cautiously, boots scraping against loose stone as they stepped into a scene that bore no resemblance to a battlefield. It looked more like a natural disaster, as if an avalanche of men, horses, and metal had been poured into the corridor and frozen in place. Broken wagons lay across the ground like shattered bones of some great beast, their wheels twisted, their frames splintered beyond recognition. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in heaps crushed beneath logs or stone, others slumped against the cliff walls as though exhaustion had claimed them before an enemy blade ever touched them. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the earthy smell of churned soil, mixing into a cold fog that clung to the cliffs. The scouts moved deliberately, not out of fear of ambush, but out of respect for the enormity of what had unfolded. Here, victory had not come from swords or spears. It had come from patience, discipline, and the merciless geometry of the mountains. They paused often, reading the story that the ground still told. The shattered shields where the first stones had landed, the snapped reins of horses driven mad with terror, and the silent clusters of men who had formed last stands that simply couldn't be maintained. There was no celebration among the Wallachians, no triumphant cries or raised weapons. They understood what this victory meant, and what it had cost on both sides. This narrow pass, once just another rugged road between valleys, now held the memory of a moment when an empire had been humbled by the land itself. The mountains stood tall and indifferent, as if reminding every future traveler that power is temporary. But terrain remembers. In the days that followed, word of the catastrophe traveled faster than any soldier could march. Messengers returning to Hungary spoke in shaken voices, describing not a defeat, but an annihilation, not a battle lost, but an army dissolved into the stones of a foreign land. The Carpathian pass that had once seemed like a simple route home was now whispered about with a mixture of dread and awe, as if it had become a living reminder of what happens when ambition outruns caution. Kings, nobles, and common travelers alike began referring to it not by its geographic name, but by what it had done, a road that taught humility to the proud. For Hungary, the loss reshaped more than military plans. It reshaped identity. The kingdom realized that power projected outward is worthless when it is not balanced with the ability to retreat, to adapt, or to respect the will of those who refuse to yield. For Wallachia, the victory was not a triumph of brute strength, but a confirmation of sovereignty. Basarab had not defeated Hungary by meeting it head-on. He had defeated it by choosing the ground, setting the pace, and forcing his enemy into a battle they could never win. The mountains had simply enforced the decision. And so the legacy of this place grew far beyond the stones that witnessed it. Travelers passing through in later years often paused without knowing why, as though the air itself carried the faint memory of 4 days when steel, pride, and flesh were ground into the earth. Some whispered that the cliffs still echoed at night, carrying the distant clatter of armor or the soft cry of horses long gone. Whether true or not, the belief endured, giving the pass a kind of sacred weight, an understanding that victory is sometimes measured not by advances made, but by the mistakes avoided. And as this tale comes to an end here on Blackstone Battlecraft, the question remains for every viewer: could any army, no matter how powerful, have escaped this trap once it stepped inside? Tell us your thoughts below. Comment your theory, share this episode with someone who loves history, and keep the story alive. The mountains remember, and now so do we.